Okay, hello one and all, and a very warm welcome to everyone joining us today from across Brussels and beyond. Thank you for taking the time to join this DOTS live webinar on Germany's new political landscape following the 2025 federal election. We're here today to take a closer look at what the newly formed government in Berlin between the CDU, CSU, and the SPD means for the EU. Mein Name ist Tarik Oran, and I'm the team leader of our German coverage here at DOTS Political Intelligence, the leading political intelligence service in the UK and the EU. Over the past months, we've closely followed the 2025 German elections and the coalition negotiations. And we recently completed an in-depth review of the new coalition agreement titled Verantwortung für Deutschland, which we'll be drawing from today. Germany is not just any EU member state. It is Europe's largest economy, a key player of legislative direction in the Council, and often also a political trendsetter. So when there's a shift in Berlin, the ripple effects are felt across the EU. This year's coalition outcome is particularly relevant for Brussels. While the new government projects continuity in many areas, it also brings a shift in tone, especially under Friedrich Merz, who has called for a more assertive German role within the EU and questioned aspects of the current transatlantic relationship. These positions mark a departure from the more restrained approach under Olaf Scholz, whose tenure saw visible tensions in German foreign profile. Rather than a dramatic shift, though, the coalition reflects a repositioning, with stronger emphasis on national interest within a European framework and a more pronounced voice in EU-level debates. So, in the next 40 minutes or so, we walk you through the political dynamics behind the coalition, the key priorities in the agreement, and also the personalities leading the key ministries. We then open the floor for questions, so please feel free to send those through the Q&A box, both during the session, but also during the Q&A session. Also be aware that we're going to record this webinar, so in case you have to log off early, don't worry, we'll send you the recording. Now, I'm delighted to introduce my dear colleague Vera Bibas, who's been a crucial part in our election coverage. She's in charge of our health and environment portfolio, and she will now give a short election recap and talk a bit about the coalition formation.
Hello, a warm welcome from my side as well, and thank you, Tarik, for the introduction. I just want to start with a quick recap of the elections. So the CDU and CSU saw a partial recovery under Friedrich Merz, our new chancellor, with about 28%, but it did fall short of their goal of hitting the 30% mark, which they hoped to secure since they wanted to have a stronger lead, especially in light of the rising popularity of the AfD, which came in second as the second strongest party with 20.8%, so 21%, before the Social Democrats that were led by our former Chancellor Olaf Scholz, which hit a historic low with only 16.4%. They did, however, find themselves still in a quite pivotal position after the election during the coalition talks, not necessarily because of their strength, but rather because of the fractured vote. The Greens, who had also been a part of the outgoing traffic light coalition, saw their support decline similarly to only 11.6%, which effectively ruled them out as a viable coalition partner. So that left us with now a coalition between the CDU, CSU, and the SPD, due to the fact that there just wasn't enough viable democratic options left. So this grand coalition wasn't formed really out of enthusiasm, but rather necessity. It was a strategic choice, despite their ideological differences that were quite apparent during the election cycle. And that move stemmed from the incentive that they wanted to prioritize institutional stability and therefore not opt for a potentially unstable three-way coalition again. But it's important to keep in mind that they only have a fairly close majority with only 12 seats. In line with the coalition agreement that they published, that is titled Responsibility for Germany, this government very much aims to project a predictable centrist governance style that is anchored in realism. And unlike the previous traffic light coalition, the tone is deliberately sober. It's pretty much designed to reassure voters, markets, and institutions that Germany remains a pillar of democratic stability, so to say. However, that image was almost immediately rattled with the start of the government. In what should have been a formality, Friedrich Merz failed to secure a majority in the first parliamentary ballot for his chancellorship, something that has never happened in German history and was obviously quite politically embarrassing, especially since he was already battling with this image of the chancellor that no one wanted, giving his political setbacks and back and forth with Angela Merkel. So that revived doubts about his authority and internal support, with markets dropping, like the DAX dropping nearly 2% since it was interpreted as a sign of political fragility, basically. So with these tensions simmering within the coalition, the public is naturally left wondering whether this will be setting the tone for the next 4 years. And with that in mind, we want to dive into the actual coalition agreement and highlight a couple of key policy areas that are dominating within it. So Tarik will start us off on an overview on economic policy, European and foreign policy. Sorry.
Yes, thank you, Vera. Yeah, as you just mentioned, we will now look into the coalition agenda and see, yeah, where those priorities most intersect with EU priorities and where Brussels should expect continuity, friction, or renewed engagement. We now begin, or I begin with foreign and European policy. And here the new chancellor's ambitions are particularly visible. Friedrich Merz has made foreign policy a core part of his chancellorship, in contrast to the reactive and often fragmented foreign policy seen under Olaf Scholz. His early statements and visits to Paris, Warsaw, and Kiev within his first week signaled not just a symbolic outreach, but an effort to rebuild trust, particularly with partners frustrated by Germany's indecision in recent years. Merz has also directly addressed what he calls the German vote problem, Berlin's tendency to abstain or delay at EU level due to internal coalition friction. So his goal is to bring back a more coherent, more clear and responsive style. He has also signaled a more self-confident stance towards Washington, and therefore favoring a balanced transatlantic relationship that also strengthens European autonomy. He's thus centralizing foreign policy also more closely in the Chancellery. So we're going to get a new National Security Council that is being established within the Chancellery, where we also have that like seasoned diplomats such as Günther Sauter or Michael Klaus, who are going to lead the foreign policy and EU coordination units within the Chancellery. And also, quite remarkably, for the first time since 1966, both the Chancellery and the Foreign Office are both controlled by the same party, thus also ensuring greater alignment. So here the aim is clear. Merz wants Germany to speak with one voice abroad, especially when it comes to NATO, the EU, but also to transatlantic circles. Then aside from Perth's, let's say, like personal foreign policy profile, the coalition also reaffirms its core EU commitments. But there the tone has changed. So Merz's choice to visit Brussels on 9th of May, which was Europe Day, was also again quite symbolic. So he met EU leaders such as Ursula von der Leyen, Council President Antonio Costa, who all welcomed the signal that European policy is once again being handled at the highest level in Berlin. Yet Merz also used the occasion to draw clear lines. He made it clear that Germany's support comes with expectations, particularly around efficiency, subsidiarity, and limits to joint fiscal tools. Germany under Merz also supports further EU enlargement, especially for Ukraine, Moldova, and the Western Balkans, but explicitly ties those to institutional reform. Then also Germany backs the robust rule of law conditionality, aligning with the Commission efforts towards Hungary. Unlike the Scholz era, which was often perceived as slow to act, Merz has indicated that Germany will take a clearer positions within the Council again. Aside from foreign affairs, external security is also now a core pillar of the German strategy. The coalition commits to higher NATO-aligned defense spending, enabled by flexible budgeting rules. Support for Ukraine is firm, and Merz has also been quite vocal about delivering Taurus missiles and also backs future NATO membership. But they also now impose some sort of strategic ambiguity of arms delivery. While Germany promotes a European security union, there's little appetite for deeper EU defense integration or joint financing. But meanwhile, on procurement, the message is clear. He favors more cooperation, but with national efficiency and industry interests also at its center. So yeah, the key takeaway, I think, is that Germany is back as a more strategic, centralized, and assertive actor, but will tie its leadership to functionality and sovereignty. I will now hand over to Vera, who's going to talk about Germany's renewed stance on energy and climate policy.
Exactly. Before we do that, please give us a quick moment of patience since we realized that we added an old version of our PowerPoint presentation, but we're moving on in a second. So while we do that, I just want to briefly give us an introduction to the energy priorities. Perfect. So we're back on now with the updated version. So when it comes to energy and climate policy, we can see a pragmatic shift from the government side of things. It's not really a revolution in either direction. It's rather seeking a balance between feasibility, competitiveness, and the EU climate alignment. So it reaffirms, first and foremost, Germany's climate neutrality goal by 2045 and endorses the EU's 90% emissions reduction target by 2040. Nonetheless, it does attach clear limits to that. So for instance, emission cuts won't need to exceed 88% domestically, and offsets through international climate projects can be calculated towards the emissions goal. That's a fairly controversial stipulation since it does risk watering down European climate ambition. Another aspect that has been similarly criticized by environmentalists is that the coal phase-out date of 2038 does remain unchanged. At the very heart of the coalition's energy agenda is, however, the return to affordability and stability. So core promise is to reduce electricity prices, namely by at least 5% per kilowatt hour, through tax cuts and an industrial electricity price. On renewables, storage, and hydrogen, the agreement continues a path of a more gradual transformation. So it promises a determined expansion across wind, solar, bioenergy, geothermal, and hydropower. The support for emerging technologies faster permitting, as well as the swift implementation of the Renewable Energy Directive 3. The hydrogen ramp-up will follow a quote-unquote technology-neutral approach, which means that it will include blue and turquoise hydrogen. Another point in the program where we can see tensions between the parties is the power plant strategy, which includes plans for the construction of up to 20 gigawatts of new gas-fired capacity by 2030, noteworthy without hydrogen readiness or clear emission safeguards. And while that was framed or is framed as technology neutral and market-driven, this move may lock in fossil infrastructure and therefore challenge EU-wide decarbonization goals, basically. Another key development is the stance on CCS. The agreement now also allows for carbon capture and storage in power plants and not just in industrial sites. A legislative package will also enable the full CCS-CCU value chain, including CO2 capture, use, transport, and storage. So while the CDU and CSU could push this demand through, they failed in another key demand, namely the return to nuclear energy. That term is notably absent in the working program. It is not mentioned at all, except for a commitment for research into nuclear energy. On transport, the coalition parties have acknowledged the automotive industry as a key sector in their working program. Notably, there is, however, no combustion engine phase out or speed limit that was previously called for, but instead the government is favoring more like targeted incentives, such as EV tax breaks, social leasing models, and toll exemptions for zero emission trucks. Aviation rules will also be adjusted in order to prevent a competitive disadvantage. Now, lastly, to briefly touch on the industrial transition, I want to highlight that the program classifies the steel sector as strategically important, with transition aid that's tied to CCS and green lead markets. The agreement also reinforces Germany's support for the carbon border adjustment mechanism and seeks to launch its own raw material fund. The support for the EU emissions trading system, ETS2, is also outlined specifically in the program, which aligns pretty much with Germany's historical preference for more market-based tools. But that commitment may actually soon be put to the test, as we see countries such as Poland, Czech Republic already calling for delays or watering it down. The agreement is also fairly vague on how it will protect vulnerable households or fund green alternatives. Notably, there's no promised or previously promised climate bonus, which could eventually affect public support. So to summarize this section, the coalition's energy vision walks sort of a tightrope between climate ambition and political realism. So in Brussels, the government will probably emerge as constructive, but also very cautious. So very firm on ETS2 and hydrogen diplomacy, flexible on offsets, and inward focused in terms of the industrial energy pricing. Yes, so with that, I want to hand over to Tarik again so that he can now talk about economic policy.
Thank you, Vera. So, as we just seen, Germany's climate and energy strategy is clearly moving in a new direction with more technological openness, greater emphasis on industrial competitiveness, and also a recalibrated path towards climate neutrality. But to fully understand where this coalition is heading, we also need to look at the broader economic, fiscal, and also the digital agenda, and how Germany positions itself within key EU frameworks. When it comes to economic policy, the coalition agreement outlines a broad consensus, but cautious ambition between the two parties. There's clear commitment to the single market and industrial competitiveness, but without strong reform ambitions. For instance, on the upcoming multi-annual financial framework, the MFF, the language is deliberately flexible, supporting a more responsive EU budget, but steering clear of big structural changes. Joint EU borrowing is also not ruled out entirely, but considering Merz's on the CDU's fiscal conservatism, I think any such steps will face high political thresholds. When it comes to cohesion or agriculture policy, we see defensive language as well. There's clearly no appetite for centralization, and there's also reaffirmation of national and also regional competencies. Zooming in, Germany's position on EU's fiscal rules remains pragmatic, but restrained. The agreement highlights the use of existing flexibilities, like escape clauses, but doesn't endorse further reform. Germany remains firmly committed to fiscal stability and also national responsibility, even as it moves ahead with a 500 billion national investment plan. Finance Minister Lars Klingbeil has expressed soft confidence, I would say, that this will remain compatible with EU rules. But how that plays out in future, especially in Brussels, will be closely watched, I think. There's also continued resistance to the European Deposit Insurance Scheme unless strict conditions are met. While there's support for a savings and investments union, the emphasis remains on preserving Germany's three-pillar banking model. On industrial strategy, the coalition backs EU-level competitiveness tools, but it stops short of endorsing a Draghi or Letta-style European industrial policy. But the Berlin government, they favor simplifying IPSAI procedures, adapting state routes, and also investing in strategic sectors. But once again, this is also largely framed around national industrial needs. There's also quite a sovereignty push, I would say, in key sectors like energy, pharmaceuticals, and digital platforms as well. But it's more about resilience rather than EU integration. The Merz-led cabinet, or rather Merz himself, let's say, he's also pushing for cuts in red tape. And when he came to Brussels to see von der Leyen, he even proposed steps to abolish the CS-DDD regulation. Closely tied to competitiveness is also the digital agenda. And here the new government is pursuing a model of sovereignty through infrastructure and smart regulation, and not the isolationist handling of recent years. So Berlin supports the balanced, innovation-friendly AI Act, for instance. They favor more European data and cloud infrastructure, and also enhanced cybersecurity capacity. At the same time, it's also pushing for lighter compliance burdens, especially for SMEs, and the government also backed the Commission's Omnibus initiative to reduce ESG reporting requirements. And finally, I also want to briefly talk about trade and external dependencies, where the government basically sticks to its traditional German positions, I would say. So with the export-oriented model that Germany has, it obviously supports fast ratification of EU trade agreements, like the Mercosur agreement. But interestingly, they also proposed a medium-term FTA, a free trade agreement with the US, despite Merz's sharper rhetoric since taking office or since being elected. Then finally on China, the tone is also notably firmer. So they want to revise their China strategy under the scope of a clearer de-risking strategy. And they also call for stronger reciprocity demands and also more assertive stance on unfair competition. So although Germany calls for more EU integration in some aspects, the new German government also put their national interest first in a lot of other aspects. And I think it's probably most prevalent in how Germany is rethinking its role in managing migration, thus breaking with the Merkel era. So to take us through this important dimension of the coalition agenda, I now hand over to Vera again.
Yes, so the one topic besides economy and industrial policy that has very much dominated the election campaign cycle was migration. And that is also a topic that's set to remain a major flashpoint in the new legislative term. So with the Interior Ministry now in the Christian Social Union hands, the coalition agreement sets the tone for a tougher, conservative, and more restrictive stance on migration. A couple of areas that we want to point out are, for instance, the asylum policies. So the coalition supports the EU's common European asylum system reform, but it also introduces several controversial elements that point to an even more restrictive asylum approach. For instance, there's a clause that allows Germany to turn away asylum seekers at the border, coordinated with their neighboring countries, which is very legally gray and potentially at odds with EU rules on non-refoulement. So it's very much up in the air if this will stand. They also set forth a stronger return offensive with longer pre-deportation detention and the removal of automatic legal aid to asylum seekers. The list of safe countries is likely to be expanded, including countries such as Algeria, India, Morocco, and Tunisia. And they immediately ended all voluntary resettlement programs and put a 2-year pause on family reunification for those with subsidiary protection. The three parties also are calling for faster asylum procedures, as well as new bilateral return deals, which pretty clearly echoes a broader EU trend towards externalizing migration management. When it comes to the Schengen area, the government publicly reaffirms its support for the Schengen area and free movement, but the reality tells a fairly different story because border checks are set to continue until a functioning EU external border protection is ensured, which is a de facto suspension of Schengen principles, also reflecting a border shift in European migration policy. And while they do frame it as temporary, the continuation of those internal controls may normalize legal exceptions even more and risk undermining the long-term integrity of the Schengen area. In parallel to these very controversial approaches, the coalition is doubling down on democratic resilience and internal security. So there's a plan to add 10,000 positions within the police, judiciary, customs, and domestic intelligence. The federal criminal police will be expanded and modernized, and the government promises tougher actions against all forms of extremism, including, for instance, bans on extremist organizations and closer monitoring of anti-constitutional parties. There's also a new Democracy Protection Act in the pipeline. What that means for Brussels is basically that it signals a more hardline approach on migration and asylum, one that does raise concerns about EU law compliance and coalition cohesion, given that the Social Democrats are usually quite a bit more progressive when it comes to migration. So in Brussels, Germany will probably take up a firm but cautious role. They will be assertive on border controls and returns, but are still tethered to their legal commitments and the democratic norms, at least as of right now. With that being said, we're closing the section on the coalition agreement and now want to have a quick look at what is changing structurally within the government and the ministries, and then give a quick overview of the key players on the political stage. And Tarik will start us off on that.
Yes, thank you, Vera. One of the more technical but highly consequential aspects of the coalition agreement is the reshaping of the ministerial responsibilities. The coalition partners have agreed on several targeted structural changes aimed at improving the federal government's ability to act. The idea is simple: bring together what belongs together and also give central future tasks a clearer home. So let me highlight just a few of the most relevant changes. Firstly, we now have a new Ministry for Digitalization and State Modernization. Although it's not as of a radical of an approach as the Doge in the US, it is a significant move. It absorbs core digital responsibilities from other ministries, and it will also lead on administrative reform. The ministry is led by a former CEO who was involved in the digital sphere before. Second, there's been a major reallocation of climate responsibilities. The Environment Ministry now takes the lead on climate protection, absorbing tasks previously spread across the Economy Ministry and the Foreign Office. This should clarify Germany's voice in international climate negotiations and EU coordination. Third, the Economy Ministry remains a core player, but with a reduced portfolio. Some of its strategic weight, such as space and climate protection, shift to other portfolios. So it will now focus more on energy and trade. The Transport Ministry has also seen a narrowing of scope. It will focus solely on transport policy, with digital policy now entirely moved out. And finally, education and research have been split. The new Ministry for Research, Technology and Space sheds education, which is returned to other institutional homes, but gains space policy, reinforcing its innovation profile. You might have already seen some of the new ministers at council meetings, or some might be present at some point in the future. So we thought it could be useful for you, the audience, to put some faces to their names. So Vera will start with the two most important ones.
Yes, so first and foremost, we obviously have our new Chancellor, Friedrich Merz from the CDU, and he has led the CDU-CSU back into government with a more economically liberal, security-focused agenda, clearly distancing himself from the Merkel era with his more conservative profile. And he seeks to project a very strong pro-European leadership. At his side is Lars Klingbeil as our Vice Chancellor and Minister for Finance. He came out on top despite the SPD's poor election results, and he aims to present a pragmatic center-left approach on digital transformation, social cohesion, a strong European Union, and to kind of serve as a counterweight to Merz. Now, Tarik will talk a bit more about these two.
Yes, so you can see Dr. Johann Wadefuhl, the Foreign Affairs Minister, who's a seasoned foreign and security policy expert from the CDU and a close ally of Chancellor Merz. His appointment signals a clearer shift. German foreign policy will now be more strategically aligned with the Chancellery. So Brussels can expect the minister who's a foreign affairs expert, values-driven and tough on security challenges, with NATO and EU coordination at its core. Then we also have Boris Pistorius, who remains defense minister in the new government. A clear sign of stability and continuity in one of Germany's most critical portfolios. Known for his pragmatism, clear communication, and credibility within the military, Pistorius enjoys broad respect across party lines, among international partners and the public. For Brussels and Germany's international partners, Pistorius remains a reliable partner focused on delivery and not necessarily on declarations.
Next up, we have Katharina Reiche. She's our Federal Minister for Economic Affairs and Energy, and she brings a blend of political and industry experience since she's held roles in both the government and the energy sector. She's known for a very pro-business approach and is expected to steer the market or to steer a market-oriented energy transition. Underneath, we have Alexander Dobrindt. As I mentioned before in the migration section, the Ministry for Interior is now in the hands of the Christian Social Union with Dobrindt as its head, and he's expected to steer a mandate for tougher migration controls and stronger internal security. He's very known for his more conservative stance and emphasis on state authority. The next person we wanted to briefly mention is Alois Rainer. He's the new Federal Minister of Food, Agriculture and Community, and he's been appointed after the favored candidate withdrew following environmental backlash. His appointment signals also a very clear shift towards conservative agricultural policy that is departing from the green reforms under the previous minister and aligns more with conventional farming interests. And then we have Carsten Schneider as the Federal Minister for the Environment, Climate Protection, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety. He is a very close ally of Lars Klingbeil and has been appointed despite fairly limited experience in the environmental policy area. He's more known as a budget expert and pragmatist, and he will oversee key files such as the EU climate targets.
Yeah, before we continue with the Q&A, I also wanted to highlight two people who some of you might recognize, some of you might not recognize, but I think who should be closely watched as well. I'm talking about the two parliamentary whips of the CDU-CSU and the SPD, Jens Spahn and Matthias Mirsch. The government is heavily dependent on these two figures as they are responsible to align the party groups on the actual voting. So, as Vera already highlighted in the beginning, there appear to be some within those two party groups who are not entirely happy with the new government, and it's up to Spahn and Mirsch to amend those cracks within the party. And with only a 12-seat majority, their task is immensely important. But they are not only the left hands of Merz and Klingbeil respectively, they could also be the antagonists to the government almost. Spahn is said to have quite personal ambitions, so could be a stumbling block for Merz further down the line. And Mirsch has already vocally ruled out the delivery of Taurus missiles, for instance, one day after the government announced to be more ambiguous in their external communication. So what can Germany's European partners expect? As we've seen, the new German government has laid out a clear agenda. It's structured, pragmatic, and anchored in national priorities. It's a coalition that aspires to restore coherence, credibility, and leadership, both at home and in Europe. But despite the rhetoric of unity, first cracks have already emerged, be it the public disagreement on Taurus missile deliveries for Ukraine, internal debates over social welfare reform, or diverging positions on defense spending. Tensions are already surfacing. Even in Brussels, the government has yet to truly speak with one voice, something that Merz has been so vocal about. His public call to scrap the EU supply chain directive clashed almost immediately with Finance Minister Klingbeil's more cautious clarification afterward. So I would say the outlook is mixed. The structure is there, the ambitions are clear. But whether the coalition partners can align in practice remains to be seen. Their ability to act in concert will define not only their domestic success, but also how the EU can engage in the world. And there's a lot at stake, both on the national and the international level. So one would hope they can deliver on their promises. Whatever friction may exist within the coalition, though, Berlin's influence on European regulation remains steady and strategically important. Germany still sets the tone on key issues like digital policy, sustainability, industrial standards, and also trade, for instance. And that's where we at DOTS come in. With our political monitoring, we help companies and associations track the regulatory developments that shape their work, with daily updates, weekly agendas, and tailored research. From energy to transport, from digital regulation to health policy, we cover what matters when it matters. So if you want to stay ahead of what's coming out of Berlin and how it could potentially impact Brussels, we're here to support. So please feel free to reach out to us. With that, I think we've covered a lot of ground, from the structure of the coalition to its policy directions and also its early thought lines. So now I'd love to open the floor to you, the audience. So if you have any questions, whether about specific policy areas, ministerial dynamics, or the broader outlook, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box. Okay, let me see. There were already some during the Q&A, so maybe we can start with those. And for those who still have questions, please, again, please feel free to put them in. So the first question was, what's the stance on public transport or energy poverty building refurbishment? So I'm going to discuss this. When it comes to public transport, the government committed to what's the so-called Deutschland ticket, the Germany ticket, which allows people to travel on public transport all over the country. It was something that was first established during the COVID pandemic as a relief for people. Initially, it cost €9. Now the price is significantly higher, but it's still quite cheap compared to other countries. So they reaffirmed the financing for up until I think end of 26, and afterwards they have to go over it again with the 16 federal states, because public transport is being dealt with on the state level. So they are going to and then they also put forward tools in order for public buses, environmentally friendly buses, let's say, to be financed more with public money. And then the second part, when it comes to energy poverty, I think one of the main tools that the government is trying to implement is so basically we're going to have the CO2 pricing system that's going to be further established with the ETS2. And in order to offset higher prices, the government is planning to reallocate the money that's coming out of the higher tax, let's say on, for instance, petrol, that people are able to receive it. So it's going to be spent again on the citizens. And then when it comes to building refurbishment, I think the government continues to have it on their roadmap. We have a new minister for building who's quite young, not experienced, but she has a background coming from a startup which was quite successful. So I think she's going to, she has this on her agenda as well, and I think it will remain a key topic in that sector. Then we got quite a lot of more. I think we have one about CS-DDD and whether to which extent the labor minister has a say on Merz's intention to scrap CS-DDD. I think, Vera, that could be something for you.
Yeah, so to quickly dive into this question, I mean, Friedrich Merz has always been quite public about his criticism when it comes to the CS-DDD, but also the Lieferkettengesetz on a national level. And in the coalition agreement, they agreed to scrap and replace the national legislation, but it was never mentioned that they would scrap like the CS or like aim to scrap the CS-DDD completely, especially on EU level, until I think fairly recently, like 2 days ago or so, when Merz said it on EU level that he aims to kind of scrap it. And I think Lars Klingberg, our vice chancellor, was quite surprised by that and also publicly denied that this was anything that they previously discussed or agreed on. And I think for the future, it probably means that Merz is going to push for more deregulation, but the Social Democrats still have some continued control or like arguing potential as a counterweight to that, because at the end of the day, they are holding the labor ministry with Bibas now. So it will probably lead to kind of internal coalition negotiations where there might be some compromises and deregulation, but I doubt that it will lead to a complete scrap of the CS-DDD. Yeah.
Okay, then we have a question on the EV purchase subsidies and whether that's actually going to happen with the government's direction on stricter fiscality scheme. So I think, they put it out there, and it's quite a long list of EV subsidies that they're trying to implement. So one would think that it should be part of or should be calculated in the upcoming budget for both for 2025 and 2026. Whether it's going to be implemented already this year remains to be seen. The whole budget cycle, let's say, it's only going to start from now on. The Ministry of Finance has sent out the consolidation demands, let's say, to the respective ministries this week. And then we'll get a first initial draft for the budget in I think in about a month's time. And then we can see, okay, is there any fiscal headroom that they can use? The government, and especially Merz, has been quite vocal about trying to cut costs by, for instance, cutting special representatives of the government in order to save money. So yeah, I think this remains to be seen. Then we have a question on health policy, which we didn't really touch upon during our talk, but as our dedicated health expert, I think, Vera, this is something you can definitely answer.
Yeah, that's a topic that we intentionally didn't really include in the webinar, since the coalition agreement focuses largely on more domestic health issues. For instance, they're aiming to stabilize the health insurance system to improve digital infrastructure, to increase the resilience when it comes to crises such as pandemics. So it's less ambitious on EU-wide health integration, I would say. The key issues that they focus on is the expansion of digital health, including the rollout of the electronic patient records and data systems that are interoperable potentially with EU systems, but it's not really the priority yet. They're rolling out a national pharma strategy continuously. They're starting a new pharma dialogue and want to introduce a bunch of pharmaceutical reforms that target the supply chain and security and resilience of the supply chain when it comes to pharmaceuticals. Big priority is also stabilizing the workforce to attract more medical and care professionals. But yeah, so those are basically the key priorities. And at the EU level, like I said, they reaffirm the support, for instance, for the pandemic preparedness programs, but they don't really focus all that much on, the EU side of health policy yet.
Okay, then we have a question about the 500 billion infrastructure fund and when it's going to be officially presented. I think it's going to be also closely tied to the budget for the upcoming for 2025. The first steps were already undertaken since the 500 billion will be split, or rather how the money is going to be spent is going to be split. So also the 16 federal states, they are going to receive some of the money, and they came to an agreement, I think, 2 weeks ago on how that money will be spread across the 16 different states. So the 100 billion that they're supposed to receive is not divided by 16, but it's divided by several factors such as the amount of people living in each state, the size of the state, the economic impact, and so on. So there, the first steps were already undertaken, and what will it be focused on? As the question implies, it will also be put or the money will be used in order to invest into the energy transition. It will also be used for road infrastructure, railway infrastructure, but also things like schools, which are in a desolate state in many cities across the country. So there will also be the money will also be used for it, but also in order for the energy transition for sure. Okay, Vera, what can we do next? Do you have one?
I can take over the question on NATO and security threats. So the question was, how is Germany addressing the growing threat of disinformation as part of NATO's security strategy, especially given the rise of the far-right AfD and ongoing debates about whether it should be banned? So I feel like Germany is obviously aligning with NATO's strategic concepts, which does classify disinformation as a hybrid threat. And Germany in the coalition agreement also agreed to step up the, protection against any form of extremism, potentially with stricter forms of surveillance. So, for instance, the Federal Office for the BFV, the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, I think is how you translate, monitors usually the disinformation that is tied to far-right actors. And now that the AfD is, as of right now, classified as extremist, I mean, they rolled it back a little, so it's still in the process because the AfD put a counter claim to the BFV. So it's not under surveillance yet, but it could potentially be a lot tighter monitored. But it's also still a bit up in the air until there's a decision on that case. But the AfD's role is very much tied to this anti-NATO pro-Russian narrative, which is the main reason why it should be under scrutiny. But yeah, I think as of right now, the government is kind of tied up a little in how far they can go when it comes to monitoring the AFD. Is my very vague answer.
Okay, then I will continue. There's a question, how will technological neutrality be further pursued? Yeah, this obviously depends on the sector. I think technological neutrality is mentioned quite often in the agreement. So for instance, when it comes to road transport, they are in favor of technological neutrality, but they don't really further explain what it actually means. So, for instance, there's no clear mention of e-fuels, for instance. Then they also use it for the topic of hydrogen, where they're clearly stating that they favor a more technological neutral approach to hydrogen, breaking with the former government who were majority talking about hydrogen, about green hydrogen, and as Vera also pointed out in her in her talk, was that yeah, now the government favors also blue or turquoise hydrogen, but also technological neutrality is also mentioned in the context of heating systems in public houses. There was this whole fiasco 3 summers ago, maybe, or 2 summers ago, where they were basically trying to ban gas heatings in houses, and now they're talking about scrapping that law and putting a more technological neutral approach, which could also mean the use of hydrogen, for instance. So it really depends on the sector, and then also what their ambitions are and how they define technological neutrality. So it's still up in the air, up for the government and the parties to fine tune almost the term technological neutrality in given scope. There was also another question about energy, which was talking about the electricity market design and fluctuating energy and electricity prices, and whether the new government is able to change the course on sticking to the old regime. I think when it comes to the electricity market design, they clearly stated that they're not trying to go for a reform of it. So that probably remains the same. And then also the question mentions the need for stable supply, like nuclear is evident. Although, as also again, like Vera mentioned in her part, nuclear is not mentioned in the agreement. First signs show that Germany is putting their foot off the brake when it comes to France basically putting nuclear energy or labeling nuclear energy as green energy, as like a green energy source in the EU taxonomy. So there you can already see that although Germany itself might not go after nuclear energy anymore, it definitely supports or is like more likely to support nuclear in the European context. But yeah, I don't think you can expect any reform of the electricity market design. Looking at the time, we still have 5 minutes. So, Vera, do you want to? Otherwise, I will just continue.
Yeah, I can just quickly answer maybe the question of the aspects that will be relevant for the Ministry for Research and the one for Education. So when it comes to education, I think the focus is very much on digitalization, so the digital transformation, and a strong emphasis on STEM fields. So to kind of build up this workforce narrative in alliance with like the AI Act and so on. Big aspect is also youth engagement and democracy building, I would say. So civic education, historical awareness is quite dominant within the coalition agreement. The Ministry for Research, however, is focusing more on resilience, I would say. So it funds studies on extremism, social cohesion, and so on. And it's closely tied to EU and NATO cooperations when it comes to resilience, innovation, and science. The research ministry also, I think, invests generally a lot into emerging technologies. It's going to look into including AI, cybersecurity, and prioritizing defense at the end of the day, in collaboration with NATO and the EU. Yeah. Tarik, do you want to continue?
Yes, thank you. Now we have a question about foreign policy, quite interesting. And yeah, can we expect a stronger alignment between the new coalition and France, especially when it comes to EU files such as defense and Ukraine, US tariffs, FTAs, and so on? I think the Franco-Allemande relationship is definitely revitalized after Merz took over. He already put a lot of effort in before reaching the chancellor's office to reach out to France, which he sees as a core partner in Europe. So yeah, his first Merz's first visit, foreign visit, was to Paris. So I think we can definitely see a stronger alignment between the two governments. They're going to implement a ministers' council, I think, between the two countries. And when it comes to different EU fights, at the end of the day, of course, they're still individual states. So it will be interesting to see how the dynamic involves, especially, for instance, when it comes to FTAs. Of course, Germany favors more free trade agreements so they can export more. France is always more on the fence when it comes to free trade agreements, in order to secure public interest. So it will definitely be interesting to see how the dynamic shifts between those two countries depending on the file, right? Then I think we can maybe finish the two final questions, which we're going to talk about green gases and renewable gases and whether the subject is of public discussion. For the time being, I wouldn't say so. So they will probably trying to prolong the use of natural gas. And I think the new Minister for the Economy and Energy, Katharina Reiche, has been quite open about having some sort of review of, okay, where are we at currently when it comes to our energy dependencies and stuff, and to see, okay, where do we might have to adjust, whether the given the situations should remain like they are. And then also to follow up on this one, there's a follow-up question talking about turquoise hydrogen, how Germany can develop it if it's not having nuclear power. And yes, the question rightly implies that Germany is quite heavily dependent on importing hydrogen in general. So hydrogen partnerships should be elaborated. They have also made it quite clear now again with Merz's visit to Italy, for instance, that they're going to continue to look into the pipeline connecting the two countries so that Italy could import hydrogen from North Africa, for instance, on their shore, and then to continue to let it flow to hydrogen via to Germany via the pipeline through the Alps. So Germany's, when it comes to hydrogen, quite heavily dependent on imports, and there also partners like Norway will remain a key player. Okay, I think we answered all the questions and we're right on time. 12 o'clock, so German efficiency once again. No, but jokes aside, we've come to the end of our webinar. Thank you so much for tuning in. And yeah, if you have any questions, any follow-up questions, maybe that you that come to you maybe during lunch break now, please feel free to reach out to us or connect with us on LinkedIn, and we're happy to always yeah, follow up. And once again, if you're interested in German politics, please feel please feel free to reach out as well. And so we can look into how we can help you and your organization. With that being said, thank you so much, and take care, everyone, and see you next time.
Thank you.